Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this video to talk about what I'm calling the logic of conspiracy theories. What I mean by that is we're going to be examining the nature and structure of the arguments that are put forward by conspiracy theorists. So an argument in philosophy, well, in life, not just philosophy, arguments come in all sorts of different shapes and forms. An argument, simply put, is just when you're engaged in conversation with somebody verbally, electronically, through text message, whatever, and they're trying to convince you of a particular proposition, of a particular conclusion. And an argument is the sort of evidence or the rationale that they put forward in order to do that. Certain types of arguments oftentimes take certain shapes, for lack of a better word. And so in this video, we're going to be examining some of the common features, some of the common fallacies that conspiracy theories of all sorts of different shapes and stripes commit. But before we do that, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what exactly is a conspiracy theory and the different types or categories of conspiracy theories. Let's begin by launching into a definition. What is a conspiracy theory? Well, Wikipedia, and Wikipedia gets a lot of hate, but I think Wikipedia actually gives a pretty solid definition here. Wikipedia says that a conspiracy theory is an explanation of an event or situation that invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful actors. In all of these definitions, there is a group of people at play. Sometimes these people are recognizable, such as the government, or sometimes they're kind of hidden behind the scenes. And sometimes this gets a little spicy, but we'll talk about who this group is. But sometimes it's up front, like the government. Sometimes it's kind of behind the scenes, like groups like the Illuminati. And a lot of times what it boils down to is these actions are pinned on a racial minority, but we'll come back to that here shortly. So invokes a conspiracy by a sinister and powerful actors, often political in motivation. So they want to accomplish some sort of political end when other explanations are more probable. And this is why I like the Wikipedia definition here, because as we'll see a little bit later on, one of the hallmarks of conspiracy theories is that they provide an explanation for things that already have an explanation or that don't need an explanation. But we'll come back to that point. We have another, not really a definition, but Matthew Denneth here points out the three common features of a conspiracy theory. The first is a group of conspirators. The second is secrecy. And the third is a shared goal. Now, Denneth's definition includes what, historically speaking, when we refer to a conspiracy theory, historically speaking, what we mean by that, and not necessarily what we mean by conspiracy theory in the 21st century. So a conspiracy can be carried out by anyone. It doesn't necessarily involve things like aliens and Bigfoot and interdimensional vampires or whatever, that stuff that Alex Jones talks about, right? A conspiracy is just a secretive plot or action that's carried out by a group. So you can think of things like what started the First World War, the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand by Gabriel Princip, who was a part of a conspiratorial group, the Black Hand, who plotted the Archduke's assassination several months before the Archduke went to Serbia, and who carried it out. That Princip was a conspirator. They carried out a conspiracy theory. Nowadays, we usually mean something different by that term. That's kind of captured in that Wikipedia definition there: sinister and powerful actions. But let's get a more concise definition of a conspiracy theory here. And I will say before I continue, just as a heads up, conspiracy theories are oftentimes involve things like national tragedies, assassinations, and kind of how the Wikipedia definition was saying, provide alternative explanations for those events. And as such, they can be incredibly insensitive to people who actually lived through those events. So in this video, I will be discussing things like the truther movement surrounding the events of 9/11, the idea that the terrorist attacks of 9/11 were not carried out by terrorists, but were carried out by a false flag operation. Ideas like this were made popular recently in the news. Alex Jones lost the court case involving the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory that he promoted, which was the idea that the mass shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School was a false flag attack. By doing so, conspiracy theorists demean, underplay, and disrespect the people who lost their lives in those events. So as a heads up, I will be talking about those conspiracy theorists. I don't want to underplay the tragedy of these events, especially stuff like 9/11 or Sandy Hook. Okay. So Pete Mandic says that a conspiracy theory postulates, we have 5 different things here. 1, explanations of historical events in terms of 3 intentional states of multiple agents. There's that group we were talking about, who, among other things, intend the historical events in question to occur. They want for it to happen. And 5, keep their intentions and actions secret. There's that idea of secrecy again. And it's just kind of elaborating on those 3 points. But I really like, now I know I'm a philosopher and I should be siding with these other philosophers, but I really like the Wikipedia definition here. I don't know, just kind of sums up everything that I'm trying to say. So we'll stick with that. Let's break this down a little bit. Let's talk about some of the negative features of conspiracy theories, aside from demeaning national tragedies. Another inherently negative feature about conspiracy theories is when we try to identify this group. Who is this group that we're talking about? Now, in some cases, it's pretty readily identifiable. So if we're talking about in the historical sense, like I said before, with the assassination of the Archduke, Gabriel Princip belonged to a group of conspirators. But modern conspiracy theorists, oftentimes the group that the actions fall back on sometimes are just the government, but in a lot of these theories, that group is oftentimes racial or ethnic minorities. Historically, this has been almost overwhelmingly pinned on Jewish people. So at the heart of a lot of 20th century conspiracy theories, and you see this, for example, in Germany in the 20th century, and this is kind of indicative of conspiracy theories as a whole. So one of the big questions following the First World War in Europe was, why did Germany lose? If you're interested in military history and you go back and examine the First World War, Germany had a very large standing army. They had very kind of cutting edge technology. They had most of the first months of the war kind of meticulously planned out. And after the war, after the loss, there was a sense by the German people, a very tangible sense, that something must have happened in order for them to lose. Someone must have been in the background, kind of pulling strings, calling shots that led to Germany failing to win. Equivalent here, the analogy might be if you have like a top-ranked football team that's going up against another team that's not expected to win, and that other team wins. Like, people immediately start making allegations. Same sort of thing happens with Germany after the First World War. And so they're looking for a group that must have carried this out and that must be responsible for the downfall of Germany during the First World War. And that group, of course, becomes the Jewish people. And the Jewish people kind of occupy this space within European thought for Practically the entirety of European history, looking back through the medieval period, even the early medieval period, the Jewish people, because of their outsider status, they practice a different religion, they come from a different place, they speak a different language, they dress differently, they eat differently, become a targeted group, especially for conspiratorial thinking. And so oftentimes when we try to identify who this group we're talking about, you can usually identify them by the first and foremost by examining what's the societal context for these claims being made, but it's usually pinned on a minority. There's a lot of psychology here, a lot of psychology to unpack, but it does seem to be one of the implications of conspiratorial thinking. I have a quote here that I'll read, talking about the consequences of conspiratorial thinking. I won't read all of this, but there's oftentimes a correlation between identifying this group, associating that group with a minority, and prejudiced views towards those groups. This was especially true in Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s, which of course gave rise to things like the Nazi Party. We see this play out in other ways. In the United States, this group is oftentimes either African Americans or Hispanics are oftentimes at the operating, these sort of racial assumptions are operating in the background of political, especially of political conspiracies. So I just wanted to identify that before we move forward. All right, so let's talk about the different types of conspiracy theories. These aren't like stringent categories, all right? There's a lot of flexibility and wiggle room here. But I just want to call attention to the fact that conspiracy theories really range very widely in scope, content, what they're about. So, for example, you have political conspiracy theories. These include ideas like what I mentioned before, the truther movement, the idea that 9/11, the kind of catchphrase there, 9/11 was an inside job. 9/11 was a false flag by the US government to distract its people from something else. Other political conspiracy theories might include basically any time historical conspiracies, and there's a lot of overlap between these two. So a historical conspiracy theory might be like the JFK assassination, which would also be political, that JFK was killed for X, Y, or Z reason by the government. So, for example, JFK was killed because he was trying to pass civil rights legislation, might be an example of that. The assassination of Martin Luther King would be another historical conspiracy. And then you get other examples. For example, people like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, who promote the idea of long lost civilizations, the idea that there were ancient civilizations that existed before the rise of modern humans. They'll point to sites like Göbekli Tepe to suggest that civilization is much older than we think, and that human history is vastly different from what you're taught by your history teacher in school. That would be an example. Or probably most famously, the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the idea that ancient humans had contact with extraterrestrials, and that extraterrestrials helped the progress of human civilization at certain points. Scientific conspiracies, I have a lot to choose from here. Most relevant to your life would probably be COVID conspiracy theories. The idea that COVID-19, almost always the vaccines, were pushed out for some sort of nefarious purpose, right, by some sort of group, whether it's the US government or whether it's Bill Gates or whether it's, take your pick. The anti-vaccine movement in general oftentimes falls prey to conspiratorial thinking, that vaccines are being used by the US government to control people. I could add the category of religious conspiracy theories here, that vaccines are like the mark of the beast or something along those lines. I guess I got supernatural. Supernatural conspiracies. This would involve things like, I would say, like cryptids, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, Mothman. There's a lot of really cool cryptid stories out there. I like cryptid stories because they oftentimes fall under the umbrella of like urban legends or folk tales, and I think that's really interesting. So let's talk about some of the common logical fallacies that all of these conspiracy theories, regardless of their content, tend to fall prey to. Logical issues as a whole. Okay, common logical faults. That's what I was trying to say. So the first is this idea of falsifiability. This idea of falsifiability goes back to the philosopher pictured here, Karl Popper. Karl Popper developed the principle of falsifiability or falsification when discussing the problem of science versus pseudoscience. So there's this issue in philosophy of science called the problem of demarcation, which is this question of how do we separate good scientific thinking or theories from pseudoscientific thinking or theories? What is the criteria that we can use to make that separation? And Popper says that the strongest principle that we can use is this idea of falsifiability. We have a quote here from Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery. We say that a theory is falsified only if we have accepted basic statements which contradict it. Thus, a few stray basic statements contradicting a theory will hardly induce us to reject it as falsified. We shall take it as falsified only if we discover a reproducible effect which refutes the theory. All right, what the heck does that mean? And Popper has in mind here scientific theories, and we'll kind of make a shift to like historical theories. There's more than one type of logic at play here, but with scientific theories, the example that Popper likes to use to kind of highlight and illustrate what he's trying to say is he likes to compare Einstein's theory of relativity to Freud's theory of psychoanalysis or Marx's theory of history. What makes Einstein's theory of relativity a good theory? Well, according to Popper, what makes it good is that it was falsifiable. So Einstein starts to develop his theory of relativity back in 1905 is when I think he publishes his special theory of relativity, 1906, general theory of relativity. I could be wrong about that. When Einstein, and you can go back and read, he wrote a paper called The Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies. And you go back and read this paper, one of the things that might strike you is that most of the things that Einstein's saying, he'll use analogies like stopwatches and trains to talk about his idea about time and his idea of simultaneity. But for the most part, he's using thought experiments and not really relying on any sort of like empirical evidence. So, for example, when Einstein wants to say that it's possible a seemingly simultaneous event could be different from one person to the next, he uses a thought experiment about a guy traveling on a train and a bunch of mathematics to demonstrate that. Einstein's theory wasn't empirically verified until the 1920s, but the reason why Popper likes Einstein is that before that happened, if Einstein's theory is true, then there were certain aspects about the physical world that would also be true. Meaning, if we observed the opposite, if we, and the thing in question here, Einstein said that space-time curved, especially around areas of dense gravity. So some way to test that, this was done by Arthur Eddington, and he invented a really ingenious way to figure this out. Eddington figured out, well, if Einstein's theory is true, then there should be a distortion around the sun because the sun weighs so much that it should distort the space-time around it. And so light traveling by the sun would be bent. And they set up an experiment in order to test and measure this. It could have, if Einstein's theory was false, we would not observe the bending of light, and therefore we could conclude that Einstein was wrong about the nature of space and time. So Popper says that the distinguishing feature between science and pseudoscience is that you can prove science wrong, and pseudoscientific beliefs are unfalsifiable. Conspiracy theories oftentimes fall prey to this fallacy. For a conspiracy theorist, the conclusion has already been reached. They already believe that they know the answer to the question, and no amount of evidence would be able to convince them otherwise. You'll see this time and time again. So, for example, if you're looking at, let's take vaccines, the idea that vaccines cause autism, or that vaccine science is somehow, the conspiracy theory is that that vaccines don't work, but they're still being pushed on the population for a whole host of reasons. Well, what would it take to disprove that vaccines are effective in preventing diseases? There's an overwhelming amount of evidence to support that. What would it take, for example, consider a silly example, the flat earth, the idea that the earth is flat. What would it take to falsify the flat earth? That one's pretty simple, right? Just put you in a spaceship and send you up into orbit, and voila, you can see that the earth is round. But there's always, and this kind of falls into another category I'm going to talk about, there's always an explanation for why that data is wrong for the conspiracy theorist. And there's no amount of false data that would disprove it. It's unfalsifiable. The next idea, principle of charity, the law of identity, loosely related to the law of identity. This one's a little bit more subtle. This kind of, let's go back to our Wikipedia definition real quick. This one has to deal with the assumed intent of the group, the assumed reason for action. Why are these people doing this thing? For the conspiracy theorist, it's some sort of negative intent, some sort of sinister purpose. The principle of charity states, we have a little definition here by Donald Davidson. We make the maximum sense of the words and thoughts of others when we interpret in a way that optimizes agreement. In other words, if I'm having an argument with somebody, the principle of charity states that I should take that person's words at face value. And this is where the law of identity comes into play. So the law of identity is one of Aristotle's basic features of logic. The law of identity states that if I say this is a cup, what I mean by that is that this is a cup. If we're having an argument, I can't say this is a cup in one premise and then turn around and say that this is not a cup in another premise. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. The law of charity is an extension of that. Says that, let's say, the law of the principle of charity says that you should take people's reason and rationale at face value until you have evidence to believe otherwise. So, for example, going back to the vaccine example, if the government says that we're fast-tracking vaccine trials in order to get it to the general population to reduce the spread of COVID-19, why are they doing that? Why are they pushing vaccines? Well, the principle of charity would say they're pushing vaccines to prevent the spread of the disease. But the conspiracy theorist comes in, right? Why would you trust the government? Why would you believe that they're doing something for the reason that they said they're doing it and not for some other nefarious reason? This is what the principle of charity is stating, that you should take people at their word. Now, obviously, there are situations in which you shouldn't. If you have reason to suspect that somebody, especially in your personal life, right, if somebody might have the intent to do you harm. But in the context of an argument, we should assume that people mean what they say they mean and not attribute false motive to them, right? You've probably been on the receiving end of that one or two times when somebody assumes that you're acting a certain way for a particular reason and that you're not. So, principle of charity. Unclear standard of evidence. This is another dense one. Think for a second about a belief, any belief that you might have, and think what sort of evidence that you have to prove that belief, to demonstrate that belief. This should be relatively easy to do. So we have a kind of a, I won't say a silly example, but a pretty straightforward example of Bigfoot. What sort of evidence would it take, or would it have to take, in order for you to believe that Bigfoot exists? We have a nice little quote here related to this point by J.L. Austin. The situation in which I would properly be said to have evidence for the statement that some animal is a pig is that, for example, in which the beast itself is not actually on view, so we can't see the pig, but I can see plenty of pig-like marks on the ground outside of its retreat. That would be one piece of evidence. If I find a few buckets of pig food, that's a bit more evidence. And still the noises and the smell that they provide, evidence still. But if the animal then emerges and stands there plainly in view, there is no longer any question in collecting evidence. It's coming into view doesn't provide me with more evidence that it's a pig. I can just see that it is a pig. So I like this example because it kind of demonstrates how the collecting of evidence works. So if I want to demonstrate to you, for example, that Bigfoot exists, what would count as evidence towards that belief? Well, footprints, right? Maybe we have footprints. In the case of Bigfoot, how do you prove that an animal exists? Hair, maybe, droppings, DNA evidence. But to say that the belief itself is true, what would it take for you to believe that Bigfoot exists? Show you the Bigfoot, right? Now that's pretty straightforward, I think. What I mean by unclear standard of evidence is kind of what I was talking about before. In some situations, so what I was talking about before, going back to that Wikipedia definition again, one of the issues that conspiracy theories have is they seek to explain something when other explanations are more probable, when we have reason to believe that other explanations are more probable. So take, for example, the pyramids of Giza. I teach ancient history a lot, and I find that a lot of people, a lot of students, believe in some form of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, that aliens in some way, shape, or form helped with the construction of the pyramids of Giza, for example. And I asked them, well, how do you know that? What evidence do you have to believe that aliens built the pyramids, or that aliens assisted human beings in the construction of the pyramids? The evidence that's pointed to is the pyramids themselves. The issue with that is that historians and archaeologists already have an explanation for how the pyramids were built that goes back to the system of labor that was used by the Egyptians, the tools that they used, the technology at their disposal. We've done a tremendous amount of archaeological excavation around the pyramids and have discovered a wealth of information about how these workers lived and the sort of jobs that they performed. So historically, there's already an explanation for why those things happen. So one of the things that's happening here is that conspiracy theorists will say that there is some reason to doubt that official narrative, that there is some reason to doubt the narrative that's put forward by historians and by archaeologists, and that the evidence that's supporting that official verdict is somehow fraudulent or faked or coerced, that the official story put forward by historians is wrong, and that is used to support the conspiracy theory. But the issue with that, going back to what I said at the very beginning, that arguments are predicated on positive evidence, not lack of evidence. In other words, if I want to convince you of something, like if I want to convince you of Bigfoot, What would convince you of Bigfoot? Hair, poop, some footprints, maybe environmental factors. What wouldn't convince you of Bigfoot is me saying, well, we don't have any, all of the arguments that you put forward to explain why Bigfoot does not exist doesn't work. You need some sort of concrete, tangible evidence that's put forward to support the conclusion. And in a lot of conspiracy theories, especially like Ancient Aliens, the evidence is always negative. The official narrative's wrong. How do you know the official narrative's wrong? Because I know they're lying to you or something like that. And the fifth thing, secret knowledge or information. For a lot of conspiracy theories, there's this idea that the truth is being hidden from you or from the general population. That whatever it is, aliens is a good example here. The conspiracy theory that the US government has made contact with or is housing aliens at places like Roswell or Area 51 or take your pick, but that this information is being kept from us, that it's secret, that it's inaccessible. The reason why that's bad in the terms of logic is that that's not how evidence ought to be used in an argument. Justification for a belief is based on the positive evidence that the individual has to suspect that that belief is true. We have another quote here. In any event, the concept of evidence is inseparable from that of justification. When we talk of evidence in an epistemological sense, we are talking about justification. One thing is evidence for another, just in the case the first tends to enhance the reasonableness or justification of the second. Evidence also, so evidence is what is used to justify a belief, but evidence has to be publicly accessible. In other words, if I'm trying to convince you of something, I have to be able to give you, to show you that evidence for you to review, for you to critique. In the case of conspiracy theories, that evidence is oftentimes absent or inaccessible. So is Area 51 housing extraterrestrials? What evidence do we have to believe that? What evidence is there to justify the belief that there are aliens at Area 51? Well, the conspiracy theorists would have to say, well, we don't have that evidence because the government's keeping it secret from us. What I'm saying is, you could say that, but that belief is no longer justified. You no longer have good reason to believe that. You may suspect it, you may believe it out of faith or intuition, but there's no rational reason for it. I went over 4 common characteristics. There are oftentimes a number of logical fallacies at play within particular conspiracy theories, but this is often pretty specific. So be mindful of this when you go into it, when you go into researching conspiracy theories, that sometimes these certain types of arguments can lead to some faulty thinking. All right, everyone. Thank you for stopping by. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. If not, see you all later.